I want to talk about Terran counters to the Ultralisk. So we start with the Marine, and the Marine is a very bad counter versus the Ultralisk. So number one, the Marine has a low attack value. So with full upgrade, the Marine deals 9 damage to the Ultralisk, while the fully upgraded Ultralisk has 7 armor. So a big part of the Marine damage is just going to be cancelled out by the Ultralisk armor. And number two, the Marine is a small unit that tends to clump up. So the Marine is very vulnerable to the Ultralisk splash damage. So I'm just going to take the Marine and put it into D tier. Then we have the Marauder. The Marauder is pretty good. Number one, it has bonus damage to armored. The Ultralisk is armored. The attack value is quite high. So the fully upgraded Marauder has an attack of 26. So even with 7 Ultralisk armor, the Marauder still does 19 damage per shot to the Ultralisk. That's not super high, but it's okay. Also, the Marauder has a good range of 6, and the Stim Marauder has the same speed as a speed upgraded Ultralisk. So if you have good micro, you can use the Marauder to kite a little bit against the Ultralisk. However, I'm not going to put it into S tier, because the Marauder upgrade, the concussive shells, does not work versus the Ultralisk, because concussive shells only affects non-massive units, but the Ultralisk is massive, so the Ultralisk is immune to concussive shells. Because of this, I'm not going to put the Marauder into S tier, but I think I'm still going to put it into A tier. Then we have the Reaper, and the Reaper of course is very bad. So the Reaper has a low damage attack of 8, and this attack is a double attack. So the Reaper has 2 pistols, and each one has a attack of 4. So again, a very big part of the Reaper damage is just going to be cancelled out by the Ultralisk armor. So also I'm going to take the Reaper and put it into D tier, like the Marine. Then we have the Ghost, and the Ghost is pretty good, mainly because of the snipe ability. So the auto attack of the Ghost is weak, because the auto attack of the Ghost has bonus damage versus light, but the Ultralisk is not light. So the Ghost with his normal attack doesn't do a lot of damage versus the Ultra, but the snipe deals 130 damage per shot to the Ultralisk, and this is really strong. You can easily kill an Ultralisk with a Ghost. However, I don't think that the Ghost is an S tier, because it was repeatedly nerfed in the last few patches. So number one, the Ghost supply went up from 2 to 3. Number two, the snipe damage used to deal 170 versus everything. Now it only deals 130 plus 42 psionic, and the Ultralisk is not psionic. So the snipe damage actually has been nerfed a little bit. Also, in the current patch, you can break the snipe if you move out of 14 range from the Ghost while the Ghost is preparing to snipe. So I think in the past, the Ghost was just ridiculously strong versus the Ultralisk, but now with all the repeated nerfs on the Ghost, it's still very good, but I'm going to put the Ghost into A tier. Then we have the Hellion. Hellion is very bad. It has a attack bonus damage versus light. Ultralisk is not light. Also, the damage value of the Hellion is quite low, so it deals 11 damage with full upgrades to the Ultralisk. So again, a big part of the damage is going to be cancelled out by the Ultralisk armor. Also, the Hellion is a splash damage unit, but because the Ultralisk is such a big and clunky unit, the splash isn't really effective. You can't hit more than one Ultralisk with the splash, because the Ultralisk is so big. So I'm going to take the Hellion and put it into D tier. Then we have the Hellbat. The Hellbat is actually a little bit better than the Hellion, because number one, the Hellbat has more health. It has 135 health. And the Hellbat's attack is higher than the Hellion's attack. So the Hellbat, I think, has a base attack of 18. But still, the Hellbat also is not good, because the blue flame bonus damage only applies to light units. The Ultralisk is not light. And also, again, the Hellbat is a splash damage unit, but because the Ultralisk is such a big and clunky unit, the splash of the Hellbat is not effective versus the Ultralisk, but it is a little bit better than the Hellion, so I'm going to put it into C tier. Then we have the subscribe button, and the subscribe button is very good. I mean, it is a lot cheaper than the Ultralisk, and Ultralisk costs 127 minerals and 200 gas, but the subscribe button is for free, so just push the subscribe button. And then we have the Widow Mine. The Widow Mine is not very good. I mean, number one, the Widow Mine attack is an ability. This is pretty good because abilities are not affected by armor. So the Widow Mine attack is actually not mitigated by the Ultralisk armor. That's a good aspect. On the other hand, the Widow Mine also is a splash damage unit, and because the Ultralisk is so big, you can't really hit more than one Ultralisk with the splash, so the splash damage gets mitigated by the Ultralisk size. And also, if you consider the health pool of the Ultralisk has 500 health, and the damage of the Widow Mine is 125, so you need at least 4 Widow Mines to kill one Ultralisk. In practice, because the Ultralisk regenerates a little bit health, you need 5 Widow Mine hits to kill an Ultralisk, and this is pretty unlikely. So it's not useless, but I also don't think it's strong because you need too many mines to kill an Ultralisk, and because the splash damage is not effective. So I'm just going to put it into C tier. Then we have the Cyclone, and the Cyclone has been changed a lot, but I think in this current patch, the Cyclone is extremely strong versus the Ultralisk. Because number one, Lock On is an ability. Abilities ignore armor, so the Ultralisk armor is useless versus the Cyclone. Number two, the Cyclone is fast. The Cyclone speed is the same speed as an Ultralisk with the speed upgrade. So an Ultralisk is never going to be able to run faster than the Cyclone. And the Cyclone has a lock-on range of 15 as long as you have vision. So with the Cyclone, you really can kite the Ultralisk forever. The Ultralisk can never approach the Cyclone when you're kiting. And number three, if you take the Mag Field Accelerator upgrade, the lock-on damage increases to 600, and the Ultralisk has 500 health. So one full lock-on is enough to kill the Ultralisk. So I think that the Cyclone is an S tier counter to the Ultralisk. Then we have the Siege Tank, and the Siege Tank is kind of a mixed unit. I mean, number one, it has a high damage attack. So versus armored units, the Siege Tank deals 70 damage, upgradable to 85. So the Ultralisk damage is not effective versus that. On the other hand, Siege Tank also is a splash damage unit, and splash damage is not effective because the Ultralisk is so big. So I think also it has a good range, so the Siege Tank is always going to get 1 or 2 free hits on the Ultralisk before the Ultralisk approaches. But then on the other hand, the Siege Tank has a minimum damage. So once the Ultralisk is in melee range to the Siege Tank cannot attack the Ultralisk, and the Ultralisk will quickly kill the tank. So I think the tank is quite of a mixed unit. It's also very dependent on positioning. If you get a good tank position, so I mean, if you can kill the Ultralisk from range, the Siege Tank is strong. But once the Ultralisk closes the distance, it kills the tank very quickly. So I think it's quite an even fight. I'm going to put the tank into B tier. Then we have the Thor. The Thor is also quite even against the Ultralisk. I mean, when you take one Thor and fight versus one Ultralisk, the Thor wins with a couple of hit points. So the Thor wins versus the Ultralisk, but it's not like a hard win. It's a very, very small win. Then if you have multiple Thors versus multiple Ultralisks, the Thors get a little bit stronger because when army sizes get bigger, it's getting harder for the Ultralisk to get a good surround. So yes, you can use Thors to fight Ultralisk, and you're not going to lose, you're not going to take a bad fight, but you're also not going to take a good fight. I wouldn't see it as a counter. It's quite an even fight between the Thor and the Ultralisk, so I'm going to put it into C tier. Then we have the Viking, and the Viking in flying mode, of course, doesn't have an anti-ground attack. So in flying mode, the Viking is useless versus the Ultralisk. You can land the Viking, but the landed Viking is very weak versus the Ultralisk because the Viking has a bonus damage to mechanical, but the Ultralisk is not mechanical. And the Viking also has a double attack. So I think the attack is 10 times 2 or so versus the Ultralisk. and double attacks are always weak versus armor because the armor gets subtracted from each of the 2 attacks. So the landed Viking is never going to do a lot of damage versus the Ultralisk. So I'm just going to put it into D tier. Then we have the Liberator, and the Liberator is very strong because number 1, the Liberator is a flying unit that has an anti-ground attack. And I think every flying unit that has an anti-ground attack is technically a counter to the Ultralisk because it can attack the Ultralisk, but the Ultralisk cannot attack back. And number 2, the Liberator has a very high damage attack. It deals 75 damage or upgradable to 90 attack versus ground units. So even a 7 armor Ultralisk, even the 7 armor is not going to reduce the attack substantially. And of course it's a flying unit, so I'm going to put the Liberator into S tier. Then we have the Medivac. The Medivac is hard to rate because it doesn't have an attack, it doesn't do anything versus the Ultralisks, but it can help your bio units like the Ghost, Marauder and Marine to survive versus the Ultralisk. So I don't know, I think I'm just going to put it maybe into C tier. Then we have the Banshee. And the Banshee also, technically, it is a counter to the Ultralisk because it's a flying unit with an anti-ground attack. So it can attack the Ultra and the Ultra cannot attack back. But also, the Banshee also has a double attack. So the attack is 12 times 2. And again, the Ultralisk armor gets subtracted from each of the 2 attacks, which means that the Banshee is not going to be able to deal a lot of damage versus the Ultralisk. So, I mean, yes, you can use Banshees to kill Ultralisks, but it's really going to take a while. So, I mean, if you use Banshees to kill the Ultralisk, it's likely that the Ultralisks have already destroyed half of your base until the Ultralisks start dying. But technically, because it is a flying unit with an anti-ground, it is a counter, but a weak one. So I'm going to put the Banshee into B tier. Then we have the Raven. The Raven is also not very good versus the Ultralisk. I mean, number 1, the interference matrix is useless versus the Ultralisk because interference matrix only targets mechanical or psionic units. The Ultralisk is none of these. Then the auto turret is okay, but the auto turret only does 18 damage. And it's not upgradable damage. So again, a big part of this damage is going to be cancelled by the Ultra armor. And it's also immobile, which means you can't kite the Ultralisk or anything. And the armor breaker spell is probably the best spell. I mean, the anti-armor missile reduces the Ultralisk by armor by 3. So this can, of course, help your other units to kill the Ultralisk. I think especially the Marine, because the Marine does very little damage versus the Ultralisk. But this becomes a different story when you make the anti-armor missile on the Ultralisk. So the Raven is not useless. The anti-armor missile can be useful. But in general, the spells or the abilities are not super strong versus the Ultra. So I'm just going to put it into C tier. And then we have the Battlecruiser. And the Battlecruiser also behaves like the Banshee. I mean, the Battlecruiser is a flying unit with an anti-ground attack. So the Ultralisk cannot attack the Battlecruiser. Therefore, you can see the Battlecruiser as a counter to the Ultralisk. But the single Battlecruiser attack is low damage. It only deals 11 damage with full upgrades. So this again means that the full Ultralisk armor of 7 is going to block out a very big part of the Battlecruiser armor. So, I mean, you can use Battlecruiser as a counter to Ultralisk, but I think it's going to take forever to kill an Ultralisk. But it is a counter technically, so I'm just going to put it into C tier. And yeah, dudes, that's it. See you next time.